Yep. Let's talk about church, faith. To make a difference, what door you walk in. If the only thing you receive is the interpretation of men who seek to do what? Gain power and wealth. If he can get you to do what he wants you to do by quoting scriptures, that's three cores of the battle. Because instead of God drawing you to him, these men are drawing you to them and then using scripture to validate their message. When God validated his message by faith in men, like Abraham, God spoke to Abraham. He didn't validate that God spoke to him with any other means but by obedience. And when he obeyed him, there was no scriptural interpretation. There was faith established. Faith had nothing to do with what Abraham did. It was the consequences of God speaking to him and Abraham obeying God. But each and every person has a responsibility to do the same thing, right? We have a responsibility to Abraham just answered a calling. I don't know what he was doing in the land that he was, but the least thing he was doing was worshiping the one true and loving God. I thought he sought more than idolatry, sought more than men's doctrines and precepts and interpretations and commands of men. He must have sought a relationship with the living God upon his heart because he left the country he was raised, the traditions, and any other thing that pointed to his past religiously, all the doctrines, all the dogma, all the sacrifice, all the burnt offerings. And really, that's what it is when you serve in interpretations of men, no matter what book they read out of. The only thing you have is an interpretation. No wonder this thing called faith is falling apart. No wonder this thing called faith is fading and becoming less effective. God moves in our heart just like he moves in Abraham. He likes to move that in your heart just like he would move in Abraham's life. There's no difference. That it took the power of God to deliver me from certain events in my life, just like it took God to deliver Abraham from his country. It's an astounding event. We look up at these people that are flesh and blood, and we think they're more glorious, more loved, more favored than we are. But God desires to separate you, to deliver you, to set you free. And you know what's bonding you. What bound Abraham is his earthly desires. Once he freed those things and sought God, he was set free from this earthly dynamic, doing what he thought right in his own sight. Whether he's quoting scripture or not, the only way we can be inspired by God is to hear him and obey. And I'm going to ask you today, do you hear him? Do you obey? Or are you just regurgitating traditions and doctrines of men? The man beside the pool of Bethesda, he was hanging out like traditionally, hey, it got to be a tradition. It got to be a way of life. This circle event in his life. But when it all boiled down to it, what he had was inspiration of the mind of man. And if you're following man and he's not inspired by God and he's quoting all these scriptures and he sounds great and wonderful. It might seem great and wonderful, but it lacks the power of God. There's no deliverance. There's joy, no peace. You're still doing what you know is wrong. And the most frightful thing in this creation called life is when you're doing what is wrong, but Satan, others have convinced you, or your own reasoning and thinking has convinced you it's right. That's a phenomenon. We follow these preachers, these so-called prophets, and they're not moved by God. They're stirred up by one thing: greed, control, just like every other politician in the land.